Sundar and Spotted Tail. Read and enjoy. Let us read the story that explores the relationship between a cow herd and cow, which describes how animals care about their masters. 12-year-old Sundar looked after the village cows. He was given rice and curry for his labor. Early one summer he took out 3 cows for grazing. He had named them Curly-horned, Dark-eyed, and Spotted Tail. He had his meal packed in his bag, which he slung across his shoulders. In the bag he also carried his penknife and pipe. With a stick he goaded the cows towards the pasture land nearly a mile away. The pasture land was a vast area overgrown with a variety of trees and bushes. At the time we are talking of, there had been a drought, everything had dried up and there was little for the cattle, just a few leaves to nibble at. It was not often Sundar was asked to take out the cattle. If it rained, the cattle stayed in their sheds. If the harvest was good, there was no need for his services because the cattle could feed themselves on the paddy stubble. It was only during the summer months there was very little for the cattle that Sundar was asked to take them out to pasture. This was seldom for more than a fortnight. But in these 2 weeks he really got attached to the cattle. Alongside the grazing ground was a lush forest full of trees of all varieties which gave shelter to all kinds of animals: jackals, monkeys, porcupines, hares, wild pigs and deer. Occasionally, even elephants could be seen. But the forest was a government preserve and no grazing was allowed there. That morning Sundar allowed the cows to go into the forbidden territory. He perched himself on a cashew tree and helped himself to a few kernels. He imitated bird calls and made flower wreaths for the cows. When his cows strayed towards the forest, he played his pipe to draw them back. He patted their flanks and admonished them gently against losing themselves in the jungle. Sundar cut a slender reed and inserted a nut in its hollow tube. When he blew into one end, the nut shot out like a bullet from a gun. He used it against lizards and squirrels. He clambered over trees, peering into bird nests and made leaf caps by pinning them with thorns. Sometimes he would dance the Garuda dance he had seen at the temple festival. A stream ran between the pasture land and the forest. There was little water in it, not enough to bathe the cattle and barely enough for them to slake their thirst and him to wash down his meal of rice and tapioca stew. In the afternoon the cow lay in the shade chewing the cud while Sundar reclined in the shadow of a rock. A monkey came near and he shot a pebble through his reed gun and frightened it away. He felt very drowsy, so he stretched himself out on a carpet of leaves and made up for the sleep he had lost at night. Sundar's deep slumber was broken by a pack of jackals howling near him. He woke up with a start. Night had fallen and it was pitch dark. He could not see his 3 cows. Probably the jackals had frightened them away, or had they been dismembered by the jackals? Had the jackals bitten off their ears and udders and left them to die? Jackals often had rabies. Dogs bitten by jackals became mad. The same must be true of cows. It was said that anyone who touched a mad cow became mad too. Or had they run into the forest and been devoured by a tiger? How would he face his elders? Would the jackals attack him? Sundar was terrified, but he kept his cool. He quietly slipped over to the other side of the rock and with his hands and feet felt the ground till he was able to find 3 stones which he put in the bag. He crept up to the top of the rock and flung the largest stone in the direction of the jackals. The stone found its mark, for he heard a thud and a jackal howl in agony. He followed the first shot with 2 more through his reed gun, and again found his mark. The jackal scurried away and began to howl at a distance. Sundar slipped down the rock. He had walked no more than 5 or 6 paces when his feet were caught in the roots of a tree. He felt its bole with his hands and discovered that a sturdy creeper was twined round the tree. He hauled himself up onto a branch and felt safe. Suddenly, the night jar, known to the locals as the death bird, called, "Burn him down." This terrified him all the more. Then he reassured himself that God was there to help him. A crescent moon shed its faint light and he was able to see better. He spied what looked like the form of a monkey recumbent against the bole of a tree. He moved stealthily along the branches till he was exactly above the monkey, then dropped his sack full of stones on its head. The monkey screamed and ran. Its companions perched on other branches also screamed and scampered down the tree. That was Sundar's chance to get away. He slid down the tree, cut a long stick with his penknife and used it to clear his way through the reeds. He made his way back to the rock, clambered up it and lay down for a short respite. By now the crescent moon had gone down and only a few stars twinkled in the sky. Sundar's thoughts were on his cows. The poor creatures must be lost in the dark. They were so helpless. Their terror and suffering would be far greater than his. He had played his pipe but the jackal's howling had drowned its notes. Hunger and thirst were gnawing at him. If only he could pluck some fruit, but he could hardly see in the dark. Then he saw a light. Could it be humans or evil spirits? Sundar broke into a cold sweat. The light was very faint. A sudden sound broke the silence. Sundar pricked up his ears. It was not the sound of trees being felled. Mustering up all his courage, Sundar once again slid down the rock on all fours and went towards the light. He saw 4 or 5 men skinning a dead animal. It was his spot-tailed cow who had delivered a calf only 4 months earlier. Sundar stole behind a tree to watch the goings-on. The men had a bottle full of glowworms as their lamp. He noticed the severed head of the cow and realized that it was not his favorite spotted tail but an old white bull. He sighed with relief. The discovery also made him bold. All he had to do was to steal the bottle full of glowworms. The thieves had covered it with sacking and only exposed a side when they needed it. While they were engaged in their nefarious work, Sundar quietly picked up the bottle along with the gunny sack and went back to the tree. He heard one of the gang shout, "A little light here." Another turned to get the bottle he had put on the stone. It was gone. Where had the bottle disappeared? They began to argue and quarrel. "I'm sure I left it here." "Look carefully. It must be there." "I'm sure I left it on the stone." "Someone has surely seen us. We will be caught red-handed. Let's escape." They decided to get whatever they could of the meat and beat a hasty retreat. They began to hack frantically at the carcass. Suddenly, they froze as the notes of a reed pipe floated across the dark. The men dropped their knives and ran to climb up a tree. The notes of a pipe fell on the ears of a jackal. It raised its head and began to howl. Others in the pack joined in a chorus. They smelt meat and came scampering to the carcass and fell upon it. From the treetop the gang of thieves helplessly and sorrowfully watched the jackals devour the bull they had butchered. Sundar had by now recovered his composure and his eyes had got accustomed to seeing in the dark. He started calling to his cows and playing on his reed pipe. The birds and beasts of the jungle appeared agitated. Birds tittered and chirped, little animals scurried past him, and the anxious chill cry of deer filled the air. But there was no sign of his cows. Fear lent wings to his feet and he began to run. Thorns and bramble caught at his arms and legs, scratching and bruising him. Suddenly, he tripped over a tree root and fell headlong. Fortunately, his bottle of glowworms did not break. By its faint light he saw that below the knee he had a deep cut which was bleeding profusely. To stop the bleeding he tied the sack string above the wound. He was in great pain and could not stand up. Sundar was filled with terror at the thought that the smell of his blood would attract some wild animal and he would be eaten alive. Or else ants would gather and make a meal of him. What horror! He cleansed his bruises with the leaves of a herbal plant and with his last ounce of strength called out to his favorite spotted tail. But his shout was no more than a faint whisper. Utterly exhausted, Sundar fell asleep where he was. What had happened was very simple. The cows had grazed their fill, chewed the cud and then bellowed to Sundar to tell him it was time to go home. Sundar slept through their bellowing and when Spotted Tail licked his leg, rewarded her by a resounding kick. The cows went back to the village without Sundar. They were tied up in their byres. When Sundar had not returned home even after nightfall, his father went looking for him. When he learned that the cows were back, he decided that Sundar must have gone to see the festival at the temple, and returned home. The next morning Spotted Tail would not let anyone milk her. She bucked and kicked anyone who came near her. The villagers thought she was sick. Everyone offered their diagnoses. She has been bitten by a snake. She must have eaten some venomous plant in the forest. The mistress of the house finally ordered Spotted Tail to be fed only with salt in her gruel instead of its usual fare of oil cakes and bran water. She was not to be milked, and her calf also kept hungry, and the two tied separately in the byre. A little later she went to the cowshed with the gruel salted rice water. Spotted Tail had vanished. The mistress was very upset and began to berate everyone. "Didn't I tell you not to let the cow out of the byre? Why did that boy Sundar take her out against my orders?" They noticed the broken end of the rope tied to the stake. "Look, she's broken loose. She couldn't have gone very far." They looked for Spotted Tail everywhere. There was no sign of the cow or cowherd. Sundar's father and Spotted Tail mistress set out towards the forest to look for them. Others joined them in their search. Spotted Tail found her way to the spot where she had left Sundar sleeping the night before. He was no longer there. Spotted Tail began to search frantically. She came upon Sundar's bag, now dirty and torn, and at last, after further searching, upon Sundar himself. He was bruised all over but fast asleep. The cow let out a deep bellow and began licking the boy all over his body. She licked away the ants and flies that had clustered over the boy's wounds. It was strange that the cow's udders became heavy and began to ooze with milk. She lay down, exposing her wet udders close to Sundar's face so he could reach them. The boy took the cow's udders in his mouth exactly as would a calf and began to suck. Slowly strength came back to his limbs. He rested his head on the cow's dewlaps and nestled against her body. That is how the search party found Spotted Tail and Sundar, the cow and the cowherd.